I woke up in the hospital with 3 fractured vertebrae, a collapsed lung, and, staring at the ceiling through a haze of morphine, a decision already half formed in my mind that I would spend the next 4 months testing exactly who in my family actually loved me and who had simply been loving what I could provide them. My son-in-law Trevor was the first person to visit after Melissa, arriving with a bouquet of flowers and an expression of concern so immediately transactional in its warmth that I remember thinking, even through the fog of pain medication, that I already knew roughly how this experiment was going to end. My name is Gerald Whitfield, I'm 66 years old, and I built a commercial real estate development company from nothing over 38 years, starting with a single strip mall renovation in my 20s and growing it, slowly and carefully, into a firm managing property developments across 4 states, worth, by any reasonable accounting, considerably more than most people in my family had ever fully understood. I kept my financial life deliberately private, a habit formed early in my career after watching a business partner's family disintegrate under the weight of everyone knowing exactly how much money moved through their household, and my daughter Melissa, 40 years old now, married for 6 years to Trevor, had always known I was comfortable but had never known, with any real precision, exactly how comfortable. The accident happened on a rain-slicked highway 11 months ago, a truck losing control in the oncoming lane, and I spent 3 weeks in intensive care followed by 2 months of inpatient rehabilitation before I was well enough to return home, still requiring a wheelchair for most of that time and facing a recovery timeline my doctors described, honestly, as uncertain in ways that frightened me more than the accident itself had. Somewhere in those early hospital weeks, lying awake at 3 in the morning with nothing to occupy my mind except pain and fear, I found myself thinking, with unexpected clarity, about a conversation I'd had years earlier with my own father, who told me, near the end of his life, that the single greatest regret of his final years was never knowing, before he died, which of his children and grandchildren had loved him for himself and which had simply been managing a relationship with his eventual estate. He'd told me that story on a hospital bed much like the one I was lying in myself now, and I remember, at the time, thinking it was simply the melancholy of an old man running out of time to sort out questions that no longer had any practical answer. Lying in my own hospital bed decades later, I understood, with an uncomfortable clarity, that I still had time to answer that question for myself, if I was willing to do something my father never had the opportunity to try. I made the decision, somewhere around week 3 of my hospital stay, to tell my family that the accident had left me not just physically diminished but financially devastated as well, explaining, through careful and deliberate lies I'm not entirely proud of constructing, that my insurance had failed to cover the bulk of my medical expenses due to some technicality in my policy, that the extended time away from actively managing my company had led to several major projects collapsing, and that, between medical debt and business losses, I was facing something close to bankruptcy, a story I built carefully enough with the help of my longtime attorney and business partner, both of whom understood exactly why I needed this deception and agreed, reluctantly, to help me maintain it. They warned me, more than once, that this kind of test could permanently damage relationships regardless of how it turned out, that even a family member who passed with flying colors might never fully forgive the deception itself. But I told them I'd rather live with that risk than die someday still wondering, the way my own father had, whose love had actually been real. My daughter Melissa's reaction, when I finally told her this fabricated version of events, was immediate and uncomplicated, offering, within the same conversation, to have my rehabilitation care transferred to her own home once I was discharged, insisting she'd take a leave of absence from her job to help manage my recovery personally, and asking, with what struck me as genuine rather than performed concern, whether there was anything at all she could sell or contribute from her own savings to help with whatever medical costs insurance hadn't covered. She even offered, at one point in that same conversation, to look into refinancing her own small townhouse if it came to that, an offer I had to work hard to gently decline without giving away too much of the actual truth sitting underneath my carefully constructed story. I want to be clear that Melissa never once, across the following 4 months, wavered from that initial response, and watching her show up for me consistently, without any apparent calculation about what remained worth showing up for, remains one of the more quietly moving experiences of my entire recovery. Trevor's response unfolded rather differently, though slowly enough at first that I nearly convinced myself I was reading too much into ordinary human hesitation. In the early weeks, he said the right things, expressed appropriate concern, even helped move some furniture when Melissa insisted on converting their downstairs office into a bedroom for my recovery. But I noticed, within the first month, a distinct cooling in how he spoke about the arrangement, subtle at first, comments about how temporary this setup would obviously need to be, questions directed at Melissa rather than me about what exactly my long-term plan looked like, a phrase that carried, even in its earliest iterations, an unmistakable undertone of a man calculating exactly how much of his own household's resources he was prepared to sacrifice for a father-in-law who could apparently no longer offer anything in return. The turn became unmistakable around the 10-week mark, when I overheard, from my bedroom with the door slightly ajar, a conversation between Trevor and Melissa in their kitchen that I still, months later, find difficult to fully process without feeling something cold settle back into my chest. Trevor was arguing, in a voice pitched low but not quite low enough, that they needed to seriously consider looking into state-assisted care facilities for me, that Melissa's leave of absence from work was putting real strain on their own finances, that he understood this was difficult to hear but that they simply couldn't be expected to indefinitely absorb the cost of caring for a family member who, in his words, wasn't going to be able to contribute financially again in any meaningful way. Melissa, to her credit, pushed back immediately and firmly, telling him that her father had raised her alone through considerable hardship after her own mother left when Melissa was young, and that she wasn't prepared to abandon that debt now simply because I could no longer easily repay it in the currency Trevor apparently valued most. I lay in that bed listening to my daughter defend me against her own husband's calculations, and felt something clarify inside me that I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to fully confirm since the day Trevor first walked into my hospital room with that too quick, too warm concern already calibrated to whatever version of me he believed he was managing. Trevor didn't relent easily. Over the following weeks, he raised the assisted care suggestion twice more, each time framing it as practical concern for Melissa's well-being rather than his own convenience, and on one particularly difficult evening, when my recovery hit a painful setback that required an emergency visit back to my orthopedic surgeon, I heard him tell Melissa, with an audible edge of frustration, that he'd signed up to marry her, not to become an unpaid nurse for her aging father, a sentence that told me everything I needed to know about exactly how Trevor had been quietly recalculating our entire relationship since the moment he believed my usefulness to him had ended. The moment that finally, completely confirmed what I'd suspected came in month 3, when Trevor, apparently believing I was asleep during an afternoon he'd stayed home from work, sat down in the living room with Melissa and raised, gently but unmistakably, the subject of whether it might be worth consulting an attorney about my competency, framing it entirely as concern for my own protection, suggesting that given my diminished circumstances, it might be wise to establish some kind of formal oversight of whatever remaining assets I still had, ostensibly to protect me from making poor financial decisions during a vulnerable period, though the specific attorney he named happened to be a colleague of his from law school rather than any attorney with actual elder care specialization, a detail that made his true intentions considerably harder to interpret charitably. He'd apparently already looked into the general process, mentioning timelines and paperwork with a specificity that told me this hadn't been an idea occurring to him for the first time that afternoon, but rather something he'd been quietly researching for a while, waiting for the right moment to introduce it as though it had simply crossed his mind in passing. Melissa, once again, refused outright, telling Trevor plainly that she found the suggestion deeply uncomfortable and wasn't prepared to pursue anything resembling guardianship proceedings against her own father without far more serious cause than mere financial hardship, and I lay in the next room, finally understanding with complete clarity that Trevor's concern throughout this entire ordeal had never once been about my well-being. It had been, from the very beginning, an increasingly transparent effort to manage what he perceived as a liability threatening his household's financial stability, and, apparently, to explore whether there remained any way to extract value from whatever assets he assumed I still controlled. I ended the deception 4 months after it began, once my recovery had progressed enough that I felt physically and emotionally ready to have the conversation I'd been building toward the entire time. I sat Melissa and Trevor down together and told them the truth, that my finances had never actually been in any real jeopardy, that the entire story had been a test born out of my own father's regret about never knowing, before he died, who in his family had genuinely loved him rather than his resources. Melissa's reaction was complicated, hurt initially that I'd deceived her even for reasons she eventually understood, but that hurt resolved fairly quickly into something more like quiet vindication once she understood exactly what the test had revealed about her own husband's character during the 4 months she'd spent defending me against his increasingly transparent calculations. Trevor's reaction was, predictably, defensive at first, insisting his suggestions about assisted care and financial oversight had genuinely been born from concern rather than calculation, an explanation that grew considerably harder to sustain once Melissa, with a directness I hadn't seen from her before that conversation, recounted back to him, nearly verbatim, several of the specific comments I'd overheard over those 4 months, comments whose actual meaning became considerably harder to spin generously once spoken aloud in the same room as the man who'd made them. Melissa and Trevor separated 3 weeks after that conversation, a decision Melissa made entirely on her own, telling me she'd simply been unable to unsee what those 4 months had shown her about a man she'd spent 6 years believing loved her family unconditionally. The divorce proceedings, once they began, were relatively quiet, Trevor apparently unwilling to contest much given how thoroughly the last several months had already exposed the calculations he'd probably rather have kept private, and Melissa has told me, more than once since, that watching him fold so quickly rather than fight for the marriage confirmed, in its own quiet way, everything the previous 4 months had already shown her. I've told her more than once that I never intended for my test to end a marriage, only to answer a question that had haunted my own father for decades, but Melissa has told me, each time, that the marriage's ending wasn't really my doing at all, it was simply the natural consequence of a foundation that had never actually been as solid as either of us had once believed. I live independently again now, fully recovered except for occasional stiffness on cold mornings that reminds me, gently, of everything that winter cost and everything it ultimately revealed, and Melissa visits every Sunday, not out of any remaining test or obligation, but simply because, as she told me recently over dinner, she finally understands exactly what kind of love is actually worth building the rest of her life around. I think of my own father often these days, wishing I could tell him that his regret, the one he carried into his final months without ever finding an answer, doesn't have to be a question every family passes down unanswered to the next generation, not if someone in that generation is willing, however uncomfortably, to finally ask it honestly.